Welcome to this second season of AlteaTalks, the dedicated podcast being brought to you by Altea, the unique provider of combined insurance and risk management solutions designed exclusively for the medical, allied health and care sectors. I'm your host, Will Marshall, and I'll again be joined in this second series by some of the leading figures from across the sectors. My guests are going to include practitioners and professionals, regulators, clinical risk and governance specialists, and an array of legal experts who are going to help us get to the heart of the hottest topics affecting health and social care sectors today. So, if you're looking for frontline knowledge and expertise, if you want valued insights into these most dynamic, challenging, and rewarding of sectors, then look no further because you're in the right place. Welcome again to AlteaTalks. Hello and welcome to this latest episode of AlteaTalks. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Karen Matthews-Shard. Karen is Group Clinical Director at the leading global healthcare provider, Acacium Group. Karen has worked at Acacium since 2010. The group comprises healthcare, social care and life sciences specialists over 4 continents. Acacium performs a wide range of services to the healthcare industry, including managing many of the leading staffing recruitment agencies and providing health and social care managed services. Acacium also partners with life sciences organizations, providing specialist workforce, managed services, and regulatory consulting. Karen is a qualified nurse who trained in the Royal Navy and has over 43 years nursing experience, 22 of which have been in leadership and director-level roles, specializing in clinical governance, quality and safety aspects of healthcare. Having a broad experience in the NHS, independent sector and across commissioning and provider organizations gives Karen a wealth of knowledge and clinical experience. At Acacium, Karen is responsible for health and safety risk, compliance, clinical standards and quality incidents, complaints and clinical claims management. She also leads on information governance and professional leadership. In her day-to-day role, Karen leads on PSERF investigations as well as on the insurer and legal partnership working. She also provides clinical advice and approvals for new services and regulatory registrations. Karen, a very warm welcome to AlteaTalks.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today, Karen, and I would very much like to focus, if we can, in this podcast on your experience around conducting internal investigations. But before we get into that, by way of a sort of scene setting, maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about your role at Acacium Group and particularly your role in carrying out internal investigations into adverse clinical incidents.
Yes, certainly. So I've been at Acacium and its previous brand names for 15 years. And my line manager is the CEO, so I report directly to the board, but I also have a direct line report to the ownership board as well, should I ever need it. I haven't and hopefully never will. My day-to-day job is the senior clinician within the organisation. So I'm providing support, advice and guidance to all of the services that we provide. So we provide clinical support, guidance to all of the clinicians and non-clinicians within the organisation. We cover doctors, nurses, AHPs and non-healthcare staff. And the issues, incidents and guidance that is needed on a day-to-day basis varies greatly, from giving advice into new services and signing off new pathways for services such as digital healthcare or third-party connections to things like pharmaceutical organisations, pharmacies and other healthcare providers as well. I investigate internal investigations that are at a senior, serious level. And although I work for the organisation, it works really well for us because I provide those investigations at an arm's length. So I'm not involved in the day-to-day running of that business or of the processes, procedures. I oversee them, I guide on them, but I'm not involved in the day-to-day management and working of them, which means that I can look at it with a fresh pair of eyes and provide fairly independent advice and ensure that we are compliant with our policies, procedures, and making sure that we action plan when they're not.
Thank you. And what types of healthcare incidents have you investigated?
Over my career, probably most of the areas, from a unexplained or unexpected death through to neglect, safeguarding, abuse. I've carried out in a previous role a joint investigation with the Home Office for a death in custody, and all sorts of worker injuries, patient injuries, fraud, and everything that comes under that remit, really. I don't think there is any particular type of incident that I could think of that I haven't been involved in.
Thank you. On the basis of that experience, maybe you can answer this. Why is it so important to have a process that ensures effective investigations of adverse events in a healthcare setting?
I think first and foremost, it's about the safety of the patient and about improving their healthcare outcomes. Having a standard and set framework to work against ensures that we are investigating thoroughly and consistently in a methodical way. You need to understand what you're investigating. So you can't investigate something that you know nothing about. So you need to have a really broad and in-depth understanding. And I think the key bit for me is, once you've got an incident on the table before you that needs investigating, is ensuring that you write a terms of reference so that when you are investigating it, you keep on track, you keep focused to the key aims of what you're investigating. Without that, the human tendency is to always go off at a tangent, and you end up losing the focus of the investigation, and at the end point potentially won't have found the root causes so that you can prevent it happening again.
Yeah, so process really matters.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you talk about investigating incidents at the sort of more serious end of the scale as sort of commensurate with your experience and seniority within the organization. Presumably that involves working on some cases with external agencies such as, I think you mentioned safeguarding, but also with the coroner, the police, or the CQC. How does that impact on how you conduct your investigations?
We investigate all of our incidents to a very high level. We pride ourselves in being very thorough and looking at the broader picture, not just focusing in on the particular incident, to ensure that we're making all the learnings we can. When you're working with external bodies, so such as the professional regulated bodies, the GMC, the HCPs, the NMC, and CQC and coroners, we tend to just carry on and conduct our investigation. And those organisations wait until they receive our final report, and then we'll pick the case up and maybe ask their questions at that point. It's key that we notify them immediately and that we ensure that they are happy in the way in which we're going to investigate, and then they will sit and wait for those reports. With the police, it's slightly different in that we engage with the police immediately, but we wait for the police to give approval that we can carry out our own investigation. And that usually happens once they have determined that there's no crime being committed, so that we wouldn't be in any way hindering their criminal investigation. With LADO and safeguarding, we work with them in a partnership way. So the incident will occur, we will report it. A safeguarding strategy meeting is usually called, or a position of trust meeting. We would then go to those meetings, and in partnership, we'd agree who would investigate which elements to ensure that it's robust, but actually it covers all of the areas that they need to, because usually it's a multi-agency investigation. So it could be partly with the commissioner, it could be with a healthcare trust if there's an admission been been part of the process, as well as us and other agencies.
And LADO is local authority designated officer, is that right?
That's correct. So they would chair the safeguarding meetings.
And that's where there are allegations against adults who are working with children, is that right?
Yes. Well, adults who are working with vulnerable people.
With vulnerable people, right.
So it could be children.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very helpful. Just taking it back a step, you mentioned earlier that the sort of underpinning objective and the reason why investigations matter so much in this space is ultimately all about patient safety. Can you just share with us some of the immediate or very early steps that you would take when you're leading an internal investigation to protect patient safety when an adverse incident is first brought to your attention and you're involved in it? And how do you address any urgent risks that you might identify to prevent further harm?
Okay. So ultimately, patient safety is paramount and central to the incident and the investigation. We immediately make sure that the patient is safe. So if there's a hazard, we remove it if possible. That hazard might be an individual, it might be a member of staff. If it's equipment, we make sure that we replace the equipment so that care can continue and provide immediate medical or emergency treatment should that be required. Once the patient is safe, the next step is make sure that we're reporting it so the organisation knows that there's an incident and seek advice. We protect the evidence as much as possible. So if it's involved a piece of a consumable, don't throw it away, protect the evidence. Report any equipment failures to the equipment manufacturers if need be, and take photographs or draw a map. I think often that's a piece that is missed. So if it involves where people were at the time or how to get entry or exit or access, draw a quick map. That is invaluable when you get to the collection of evidence at the investigation stage. And then obviously during all of that and running at the same time, not waiting, is the support of the staff that have been involved in providing debriefs where they're required. We obtain statements and documentation evidence as we're going and writing a timeline as early as possible, as close to the incident. The further you get from the incident, things become a little bit muddled in your head, and times are the thing that tend to fall away quite quickly. Can't remember whether it was 10 past 10 or 20 past 10. In an incident, a serious incident investigation, that actually can be quite crucial into the outcome and obtaining and understanding what the root cause was.
Yeah, thank you. And you've talked about sort of engaging and supporting the staff. But what does the duty of candor mean in practice for you and your colleagues, and how do you support open, honest communication with patients and families of patients when something goes wrong?
So the duty of candor obviously requires you to be fully open and transparent out with patients and their families. And when something's gone wrong with their care or treatment that potentially may have caused harm, it's providing that sincere apology as soon as possible and providing assurance that a robust investigation will follow. So we do our duty of candor in 3 stages, really. So the first one is the immediate going to the patient, explaining. Always try and do that in person. It's not always possible. Try and do that in person, and then leave them with a letter that tells them what you've just told them about what happened and what's happening next. We would then conduct the investigation and keep constant communication with the patient and the family as they wish. Some patients don't want it. Other patients want an update weekly or fortnightly while you're conducting that investigation. For serious cases, investigations can take a long time. They don't happen within a week. Once we have investigated, we would then tell the patient that we've completed our investigation and have tried and arrange to meet with them. We would hold a meeting with them to walk them through the report before supplying them with the report. And this mainly is not because we're trying to hide things. It's about giving the patient as much information and explanation rather than them just reading it within a report. Then we would leave them with the report, and then we do a follow-up meeting to say, now you've read the report and digested the information that we've spoken to you about and you've read, do you have any further questions? We find that in the initial stages, patients often don't want to hear it. As we get to the end, and if you've done it well and you've got the open and transparent communication correct, we find that patients are very grateful and thankful, even when something has gone wrong.
Yeah, it really makes a difference, doesn't it? Thank you for that answer. Can I just ask something around the issue of culture? We hear a lot about culture in healthcare organizations and in governance and so on. How do you maintain a just culture during investigations, particularly when human error has been involved?
It's quite a fine balance. I think where human error is involved, you have to move the focus from blame to a learning and improvement culture. The only way you can do that is by communicating, by involving people in investigations and feedback sessions so that they can see that actually we're not blaming. That doesn't mean to say that we don't hold people to accountable when it's required. We do. If that is an element of the investigation, I, wherever possible, remove that part from my investigation, and that passes over to the people team for them to manage that. They obviously need the outcome from the investigation of the findings and the recommendations, but we don't do any of that people management and holding people to account from a people team point of view during the investigation or within the investigation process. Staff, when they're involved in an incident, it feels very personal. It feels like you're being attacked. I think I've been there myself. So I think having the empathy and being able to support them, offering debriefs. We do lots of feedback sessions with small teams and with big teams. We always start those feedback sessions off by stating, this is about learning. This is not about pointing fingers. However, if anybody ever feels uncomfortable, then, they can leave, but we make sure we follow up with them immediately. And at the end of those sessions, we always offer either one-to-one or group debriefing if they've got any further concerns or questions. They have to feel supported, and they have to know that we're looking for improvements. And then they have to see that the improvements occur, which shows that there's a full cycle. It's very empowering when you're part of that cycle and you can see the improvements rather than just reporting something, somebody asking you a million questions about it, where you feel a little bit threatened, and then it goes into a dark hole where nothing happens. So I think one of the most powerful things about ensuring it's a just culture is the feedback piece and ensuring that they can see what's happened.
And do you find that in turn, going forward, helps staff feel safer to speak up and to be more open with the investigation process?
Yes, I think it does. If somebody's made an error, then the worst thing somebody could say, is, oh my God, how have you done that? If someone's made an error, it's about being very calm and cool and saying, thank you for reporting it. It's really important that you've done that. Now let's work together on how we can ensure that it doesn't happen again, rather than you did this or you did that. That's not helpful at all. That will drive reporting undercover and people will stop reporting. I think the other thing goes back to the feedback again. If you're constantly reporting issues and you don't get feedback, eventually you'll see, well, what's the point? I didn't see what happened with that, so I won't bother reporting the next time something happens.
Yeah, sure. Can I just move it on away from the staff and ask you about documentation and specifically why record keeping and documentation, or effective record keeping and documentation, is so important? And maybe you could share some of the more common risks and pitfalls that you've encountered around that subject.
Those that work with me closely know that the first words out of my mouth when I find that something isn't documented is, if it isn't documented, then it didn't happen. Regardless of how often you do it that way and how regularly you undertake that practice, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And I know it's difficult when things are busy for you to make time to do that documentation, but it has to be documented. It plays a crucial part in effective record keeping and avoiding common risks and pitfalls. Robust and accurate, timely documentation protects patients, but it also protects you as a staff member, and it protects the organisation as well, because that's the evidence that we have to rely on further down the line. If this goes to either a civil proceeding, so somebody makes a claim against you, or if it goes to a criminal proceeding in things like investigations into corporate manslaughter, for example, you need that documentation and it needs to be consistent. It also needs to be legible. So when you talk about what are the themes, I find is often the document isn't there, or if it is there, sometimes it's illegible, so you can't read it. It's not dated or it's not signed. Really difficult to use a piece of documentation in an investigation that you don't know what day or what time it occurred. And then I think the next piece for me is that what is documented isn't descriptive enough. And I go through lots of care records in the investigations I do. And a care record could be very, very explicit about what the patients had to eat, what they've had to drink, who came to visit them. But there's no record that's documented of what you did in a care piece at 10 o'clock. Did you do pressure care? Did you do mouth care? So it's very descriptive sometimes in the day-to-day activities of living, but not so descriptive in the care that's being delivered. So often that is a pitfall that people fall into. And then there's the issue about the document just goes missing. So it's lost in transit, it's sent to the wrong address. And obviously that pulls in then all of the GDPR issues about protecting the individual, the data subjects, data to the best of your ability.
Just going back to the investigation, please can you walk us through your approach to effective root cause analysis and how you identify root causes of events and incidents through the systemic investigation process you've described, and whether there are any particular tools or models that you use to identify systemic causes?
Okay, yeah. So the first thing we do following an incident, once we've made sure that the patient's safe and then that we've supported the staff, is we have a 72-hour report that's written, which is giving all the information that you have within those first 72 hours. It's not complete. There will be often things that are missing that you aren't aware of at that time. But that 72-hour report gives you enough information to be able to write your terms of reference. And you need to do that fairly quickly. So the terms of reference then guide you on what you follow and what you're going to investigate. One of the key tools for me is called a tabular timeline. And I've used it for years. It was part of the old MPSA. It's still part of the PSERF, the Patient Safety Incident Framework that is in place now for investigating serious incidents. It allows you to put every point in time with who was there, who was present, what the event was at that time. So was the medication administered then? What documentation or evidence you have? What documentation or evidence do you not have that you would like? And then what questions do you have about that particular moment in time? And then you identify whether it was a service issue or a clinical issue. And you do that for each point in time. So it could be at 9:05, the child was admitted. At 9:25, the house officer came and clerked the patient in. Things at every point in time. When you've got all of that written down, that provides the structure for the questions that you need to ask in interview with any of the people that have been involved. So it's quite a methodical. It does take time. And I think that's one of the barriers to effective investigation, is not having the time or trying to do it in a rushed way, because you will miss things then. But the question about how do I get to a root cause is I go back to some of the legal training I've had, and it's the but for question. So you've got something that occurred. The but for question is, if that didn't happen, but for that, the incident wouldn't have occurred, then that could be a root cause. If you say, but for that, the incident may still have occurred, then that isn't potentially your root cause. And it's going through each one of them in those. And of course, you can have multiple root causes. Yeah. So getting to one root cause and then saying, I've done it, actually is one of the pitfalls that people do in investigations.
Yeah, and also making sure that it's, as you say, so rigorously evidence-based.
Yes.
And not reaching conclusions that are speculative or that go beyond what the evidence enables you to do, or maybe would be a matter for expert opinion or some, for a different type of investigation or opinion.
A robust investigation report wouldn't have any of that. It doesn't have personal opinion. It doesn't have hearsay. Or if it does, you actually identify that this is hearsay. And by doing that you are only using fact. So when you read an investigation report, you want fact, whether that be photographic, whether it be written in statements, whether it be photographs and pieces of equipment, policy, procedure, NICE guidance, regulatory standards. All of it has to be linked into a factual piece, because otherwise anybody reading your report in a critical way, so for a civil claim or a police investigation, that undermines the whole aspect of the report if you've got elements of that in it. So keeping it factual, keeping it concise, and then drawing your conclusions and your root causes from fact gives the report the kudos that it deserves, because it takes a long time to do it. So you want people to really appreciate and understand the report and be complimentary about it, I suppose.
Yeah, and also the report is almost always disclosable in subsequent legal proceedings or an inquest or whatever it is.
Yeah, always. I haven't come across a time when it's not been disclosable.
No, I haven't either, actually. So you mentioned earlier about the importance of learning. Can you share with us how you translate the findings that you've gathered during the investigation into meaningful learning and action points for the organisation? And if you're able, could you share any examples where an investigation that you've led has resulted in major improvements in the way that care is provided or things are done?
Yeah, certainly. So the report will always have its findings, and then it will have recommendations. Those recommendations will always be written by me if I'm the owner of the investigation and have written the report. I don't create the actions against the recommendations. I then deliver the recommendations to that section of our organisation, to the senior clinicians and operations and managing directors. They take those recommendations and look at what they need to do to move the dial on that recommendation. They will always be multifactorial. It won't be just do one thing. So an example would be if staff weren't sure about what to do. So for that recommendation is we need to ensure staff are appropriately trained and competent to deliver the care. That would be a review of training. The action would be a review of training, and action would be review of the competence process. So there would be multiple. They write the actions, they come back to me, and then I approve that those actions will in fact address the recommendations. They are put into a action plan, which each action has a named person with a due date. And then we record progress, not just when it's been completed, but progress against that action with a closure date. And if the date is delayed at all, the date isn't amended, they then have to put a reason for the delay and keep updating it. Once we've got all of the action plan completed, often they'll say, well, we can close it now, can't we? We don't. I don't. What I then need to see is evidence that the actions have been completed, but I also then need to see the evidence of the business as usual. How are we monitoring it? And is the monitoring showing that actually we have indeed moved the dial and that practice has changed? So that's the process for ensuring that it happens. And often when we're involved in a coroner's inquest or the CQC are involved or any of the healthcare regulators are involved, they would want to see the action plan and they would want to see the progress against it and also that the practice has changed. So we're not just doing it for our own sake. We need to be able to evidence that externally as well. The final part of the question was whether some of the things that we've done that have changed practice, many of them. We've had instances where it's changed our process for medication and transcribing of medications. We've got evidence of changes that have been made to a clinical structure. So who's doing what, when and how. We've got evidence of having to change, obviously lots of policies, lots of procedures, implementing procedures that weren't there previously or updating ones that have got a significant gap in them. So multiple. I have got evidence of ones where we've had a whole organisational change to a division that has included change in policy, change in procedures, change in an increase in numbers of staff, changes in roles and responsibilities, and changes of clinical oversight. So that would be on the back of a really serious incident that was had multiple factors that ran through it. So yeah, many changes. We also have done where we've had an incident that's occurred not in our organisation, but has been a significant incident in somebody else's organisation that we maybe have been on the periphery of. We've taken the outcome from that and then reviewed that as a group and say, could this be us? And if it could be us, what do we need to do to ensure it's never us? So we take other organisations' investigations and use those as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually, because do you also review and look into near misses as well? Yeah,
we use a system for recording incidents, complaints, and near misses are reported. And we do trend analysis on a monthly basis, which is monitored through our quality and safety and governance meetings, so that we can look to see if we've got a trend of a particular element. We then look against that trend around what our current risk status is for that area. And so we're trying to triangulate that data all the time, which again impacts and inputs into improvements.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful and interesting. Just to wrap up on the UK investigation side of things, first, you've mentioned PSURF on a couple of occasions. Can you explain in very sort of broad lay terms how PSURF has impacted and the changes that have resulted from the introduction of PSURF?
Yeah, so prior to PSURF, it was quite sort of dictated what level of investigations were escalated and reported. PSURF has moved away from that because it could be looks like a fairly insignificant incident that wouldn't have hit the threshold previously, that actually has got such profound improvements and requirements for improvements. So PSURF gives you the ability to actually make an assessment as to whether an incident actually meets that threshold from your point of view. It's focusing on learning and quality improvements rather than being punitive or blaming. Now, we as an organisation have managed our incidents like that for a long time before PSURF. So it's giving a structure now that reflects what we do, but it's ensuring that it's a consistent and robust investigation to a particular standard, and that standard is the same across the healthcare arena. And that's key. So the way I would investigate an incident that falls under a patient safety incident that meets the framework requirements, everybody else would be using that same template, that same process. So we get like for like investigations rather than something that's very simple over here and something that doesn't meet a standard over there.
Yeah, thank you. And you've mentioned as well that you've seen other organisations investigations on a regular basis, and that's quite a regular scenario for you. What are some of the more common mistakes or pitfalls that you see in incident investigations?
People undertaking them that don't have the right training or the right skill, because it is a skill to do them. Some people are more suited to doing investigations than others. Some have a more analytical mind and a process that they go through. I think not having a terms of reference, or the terms of reference that are in there are a little bit woolly, also doesn't help. Rushing the investigation, not having a complete timeline, and therefore when somebody's analysing the investigation, it doesn't quite add up or doesn't quite make sense. Poor interview skills. So when people are interviewing people, they ask a question, the interviewee gives you an answer, and then they move to the next question without really taking in what the answer was and whether there's any further questioning that you'd want to add around their answer. So quite often I try and do the interviews myself, but the people that work closely with me now over the years know that that's my expectation. So they will do that. And not being factual about having either unqualified opinion or hearsay within the report. I have seen investigations where somebody has put something along the lines of all of the staff in interview, or all of the staff stated they did not do this or did not see this, and that's been put into the report, but no statements from the staff and none of the staff's own voice. So it's one person giving their opinion about what other people. And I've seen an investigation in a regulatory case where the investigation has stopped, and actually they haven't been able to continue it because they didn't have enough factual evidence, and the evidence wasn't from the person that was giving it or should have given it.
Thank you. We talked at the very beginning about Acacium Group being a global organisation, and I know that in recent years you have spent quite a bit of time working in the US. And I just wanted to finish off by asking you a couple of questions about the comparison between your work in the UK, which is obviously what we've been talking about to date, and in the US. And to start off, really just to ask what you would say are some of the biggest differences and challenges that you've experienced when it comes to investigations and clinical governance and quality assurance and so on in the US compared to what you're obviously very experienced and used to in the UK?
I think the big one is the regulators, or the regulatory playing field and the legal play field, because in the UK, we've got 4 countries with 4 healthcare regulators with standards that are fairly similar because they all link back to the Healthcare Act. And we've got single professional bodies. We've got one for doctors, we've got one for nurses, we've got one for allied health professionals, one for social workers. In the US, they have federal law, they have nurse boards, but it's per state. A lot of the regulatory information, the compliance status and the law is different state by state. So we would have to go to, 28 nursing boards. So that's one of the key differences is it's much more complex, and it depends which state you're sat in, which state the nurse comes from, rather than just knowing it's under the NMC, for example. And I think the UK's National Health Service provides universal public funded healthcare, and it focuses on equal access based on clinical need, while the US systems is quite financially, or has very heavy financial aspects, and the coverage levels therefore vary greatly. So yeah, I suppose access is clinical need versus whether you've got the financial means. Waiting times are longer in the UK because it's a public funded service, can be shorter in the US, but again, it comes back to whether your insurance cover and what insurance cover you have.
Does that impact on the standard of care then? If somebody has a comprehensive insurance package that entitles them to the gold standard care compared to somebody who has a much lower level of insurance cover or no insurance cover, would you be looking at different standards of care applying to those different types of funding?
No. Standard of care is the standard of care that everybody should be. What it does impact is the access to certain elements of care rather than the standard of the care being delivered. And I think that's probably a key differentiator between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, are there any cultural differences that influence the way adverse incidents are reported and investigated between the UK and the US?
Whether it's cultural, I think, is quite a difficult question to answer. I think there are some key differences. So if in the UK, we have the learning from patient safety instance. In the US, they have the National Quality Forum and the Agency for Healthcare for Research and Quality. So we look in the UK to improve patient care and systems. That's the focus of incident reporting. In the US, it's to collect data to identify hazards and develop interventions. So a little bit of a subtle difference. If you look at reporting, in the UK, we encourage reporting of all incidents, including near misses and hazards and risks. In the US, the reporting relies on a very standardized definition and coding formats for reporting serious incidents. The investigation side of it is equal. It's the same. It could be a local manager. It could be a group. So I don't think there's any real difference there. And then the next key difference really is feeding back on incidents. So in the UK, we feed back to reporters. We often give access to the data so they can get a deeper understanding. Because of the legal framework in the US, their feedback is usually more limited compared to the UK, because of the litigation piece.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the litigation piece and whether that emphasis on litigation in the US changes how investigations are well communicated. And I think that's really what you were just speaking about.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable that the emphasis of litigation does influence, but I think it influences it in a good way for the investigations that are happening. And I think that's because their investigations, they're more cautious because of the field it's going into litigation, and focused on documenting everything meticulously, as well as influence how their findings are communicated. So I think it's probably not as open, but I think it gives a level of assurance that the quality of what's being documented and what's being...
And I don't know. Are incident reports disclosable in legal proceedings in the US in the same way that they are in the UK?
Yeah.
And are there any UK practices that you found work really well in the US context that you've introduced into the US?
It's quite difficult because in the US at the moment, we're a staffing provider rather than a health services provider. That is a market that we're looking to move into. I think when I first went over there, it's a bit like the UK several years ago is, it's an agency, just stop them working, rather than actually, no, there's an issue with that individual. We need to look to see how can we help them improve and not do the same again. So I think I've now got a director of nursing in the US, and she spends a lot of her time working with staff within the facilities, assuring them that actually we will do our level of investigation, we will support and we will assist. So I think that's a really good piece, but that's probably its limit.
Thank you. It's fascinating. I'd just like to say thank you again, Karen, for agreeing to appear on the podcast and for being such a fantastic guest. It's been so illuminating and helpful to get the benefit of your expertise into this hugely important area that I know a lot of our listeners are going to benefit from. So thank you so much, and very nice to see you again.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of AlteaTalks. If you did, please don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review on whatever platform you're listening on, as this helps spread the word. If you have any questions or comments or topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes, please do contact us, as we'd love to hear from you. You can find us on LinkedIn or visit our website at www.alteainsurance.com. Stay tuned for more episodes, and until next time, take care of yourselves. The information contained in this podcast is not intended to represent a complete analysis of the topics presented. It is provided for information purposes only. The views expressed are personal to Will Marshall and Karen Matthews Shard and are not intended as legal advice. No responsibility can be accepted by Altea or Acacium Group for any reliance placed upon them. Independent legal advice should always be obtained before applying any information to particular circumstances.